Today on The Nation Speaks, the growing corporate activism in reaction to Georgia's new election law is facing pushback from conservatives. And in America Q&A, we get to hear what regular Americans think about whether organized sports should weigh in on politics. It's a theme we hear a lot about. There's a racism crisis in America. But how much of that racism is shaped by perception? A brave researcher decided to find out. Just over a year ago, work life for most of us was majorly disrupted. So how's that been going? We asked three very different professions. Then America Q&A asked people across the country the same question. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. A month ago, Georgia passed election reform laws explicitly to address the long list of problems that came to light during the last elections. There were enough questions, confusion, and evidence of at least some voting irregularity to trigger 3 recounts. Georgia's new law was meant to resolve these problems before the next election, but it's instead sparked a maelstrom of protest from Democrats and corporate America. The accusations are of racism and voter suppression. Atlanta-based corporate giants like Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines and dozens more companies and celebrities have spoken out against the law. Major League Baseball took the dramatic step of pulling this year's All-Star game out of Atlanta in protest. President Joe Biden has said the law is more racist than segregation.
And it's just not right. This is Jim Crow on steroids, what they're doing in Georgia and 40 other states.
Representative Burgess Owens from Utah, who grew up himself in the Jim Crow South, took particular offense to this accusation.
It is disgusting and offensive to compare the actual voter suppression and violence of that era that we grew up in with a state law that only asked that people show their ID. This is the type of fear-mongering I expect in the 1960s, not today.
Other Republican politicians have gotten involved and are trying to apply counter-pressure, like our first guest. We have with us now U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. Senator, thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
I'm delighted to join you. Thank you.
So now you co-sponsored legislation along with Senators Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Mike Lee, and Marco Rubio to strip Major League Baseball of the antitrust exemption it's had for 100 years. And that's being done to punish the league after it decided to pull this year's All-Star game and draft out of Georgia to protest the state's new voting law. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it doesn't seem that this is going to deliver an immediate catastrophic blow to the league, but it's being done to send a message. Why did you choose to take this action?
Well, honestly, I do think it would deliver a blow to the league because what it would do is open up the baseball leagues for more competition and for new entrants into the world of baseball. And that would be a good thing. Now, also pointing out to MLB that they have a responsibility. They do have this antitrust exemption. They have been able to operate under this. And for them to step in and say, well, we're going to start to pick winners and losers. And if we don't like something that the government of an entity is doing, then we'll just pick up these teams and move, or it is just so, it's inappropriate. And so this is a proper action. There is I think people in Georgia now are beginning to look at this and say, hey, wait a minute, the people you're punishing are us. And look at the small business owners there in DeKalb County, Georgia, that were planning on having this game as a way to help recover from the pandemic. And they have been disenfranchised because there is an incorrect definition of this law. It has been misrepresented by some companies and by some entities like MLB as to what it does. It does not restrict voting. It does not suppress voting. What it does is to expand both the opportunities to register to vote to have ballot access, and it makes certain that votes that are legally cast by Georgians will be counted in those elections. The law is all about election integrity, and it is being misrepresented.
How much do you think Major League Baseball's move was an ideological objection, and how much perhaps fear of Atlanta becoming a playground for protests, especially they're going to honor Hank Aaron? How much do you think that factored into it?
I have no idea, because I'm not in their corporate boardrooms, and I'm not a part of the phone calls that MLB has conducted in order to arrive at their decision. What I do know is that they have sent a message that they have chosen a side in a political debate, and that side is clearly not with the elected representatives of Georgia. And people are going, hey, wait a minute. Our voting laws are far less restricted than many other states. So why are you picking on us? And this is something that I think MLB will see people say, hey, I'm not going to buy a ticket to a ball game. Or if they do show up, what will different MLB teams do when people say, I will not show you my ID? If you say showing an ID is a racist act, do not ask for my ID to come here and watch a game, and don't ask for it if I choose to buy a beer. Don't ask for an ID if I board a flight. Don't ask for an ID if I apply for government benefits, or if I register a child for school or go to have lunch with my child at school. Don't ask for it when I go to the doctor's office, and don't ask for it when I go to the liquor store, or I buy cigarettes, or I pick up a prescription.
So let me ask you this. One of the things that Baseball Commissioner Robert Manfred said in a statement is that this move was the best way to demonstrate our values as a sport. And the day before they made their move, they signed an extended agreement with Tencent, which is a very large Chinese tech company that has very close ties with the Chinese Communist regime, which of course has a horrible human rights record. And Tencent's also put pressure on the NBA when former Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey supported the protesters, the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. So what sort of values, what kind of statement do you think this is making?
I think it's a statement that probably they wish they had not made, because the Chinese Communist Party does not wish the United States or the private sector in the United States well. They are intent on global domination by the time we get to the midpoint of this century. They are not seeking to be a member of the community of nations. They want to dominate the community of nations. The genocide they are carrying out against the Uyghurs there in Xinjiang province is something that they should be held to account for. They are using the Uyghurs as slave labor to produce goods for NBA licensed merchandise, MLB licensed merchandise. They are using that slave labor to manufacture merchandise for other companies like Nike, like Apple. And these companies should be standing with the United States of America on the values of freedom and free enterprise and free people. And they should have the guts to look at the Chinese Communist Party and say, committing a genocide is wrong. Going after the Hong Kong freedom protesters, breaking your word to Hong Kong, going back on your word, and then imprisoning these individuals that are freedom fighters, putting the Chinese Communist Party's police force on the streets of Hong Kong, carrying out human rights violations against the Tibetans, the Mongolians. These corporations should be able to stand up and say, we're going to stand for freedom. We're going to stand for free markets and free people. And Chinese Communist Party, you need to be listening to us, not us bowing or listening to you.
Has there been any response at all from the baseball commissioner, Robert Manfred?
Not yet. We're still waiting. I guess they're in the timeout box.
And let me ask you this. Do you think this pressure is having the impact of, or perhaps intended to, intimidate other states away from passing similar legislation?
No, I'm delighted to know that so many states this year are reviewing how they participate in the voting process. You know, the Constitution gives the right to set the time, place, and manner of elections to the states. And because of that, it is the state legislatures' duty and responsibility. And they work with the subdivisions, which are the counties, to make certain that voter rolls are cleaned up. And this year, many people are putting that emphasis on cleaning up these voter rolls. And that is something people can do. Go to their county election commission. When's the last time you purged the voter rolls? And remove the names of people that are deceased. You know, you have to get those right. That is the foundational part of having integrity in the election commission. And states and counties are going through this process. They're making certain that the rolls are right so that if they do mail out ballots, they're only going to people that live in that county or live in that state. And they're standing up and pushing back on this horrendous H.R. 1S1, which would federalize the electoral process, would mandate that states do mail out ballot and allow ballot harvesting, and require states to put all of these different databases they have, like university students and business licenses, things that include people that are not residents of the states, but may work or come into the state for a short period of time for education. It would require that all of those names go into your voter database. It would also remove the ability of local counties to clean up their database. It is a recipe for fraud, and I'm delighted that so many states and state legislatures are taking their responsibilities seriously and are working to clean up these databases.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's good to join you. Bye now.
Bye-bye. While Republican politicians are using their tools, legislation, conservative groups are also getting involved. Our next guest is trying to hold corporate America accountable for its objections. Joining us now is Scott Shepard. He's the Deputy Director of the Free Enterprise Project, which is part of the National Center for Public Policy Research. And Scott, you recently submitted questions to shareholders' meetings to two CEOs, to Bank of America and Coca-Cola, and they gave you some sort of answers. These are both companies that have come out against Georgia's voter reform laws. Tell me what happened. What kind of answers did you get from these companies?
Well, at Coke, they sort of dodged our question, which specifically asked, if you're objecting to voter ID, how is it that you can demand, in particularly Bank of America's case, demand ID from borrowers and from, in both cases, from visitors and employees and investors who want to vote their shares at shareholder meetings. Coke answered a pre-written, staff-written question about the voter law generally. And while they had said that it was unacceptable and racist before, they backed off and said, well, gosh, we need to all work together to make sure that elections are fair and that everyone believes in them. And I think that's right, but that doesn't involve attacking Georgia's or anybody else's attempts to make voting honest and clean and fair. And then at Bank of America, they actually took our question. And Brian Moynihan, who's the CEO of Bank of America, hemmed and hawed and started to claim that he hadn't said that voter ID and the voting law was racist and unacceptable. And then he backed off of that. And finally, he said,
the right to vote is core to America, and that we want to make sure it's preserved and extended to the fullest extent possible. one of the things is there's lots of provisions in these laws, and that's why last week, after looking at some of the discussion, I got to the conclusion that maybe we need a bipartisan commission.
It might be. If it were truly bipartisan and represented everybody. But what we could certainly expect is that there'd be a lot of hard leftists on that commission, and then Mitt Romney or somebody else from the right-wing surrender crowd, and it wouldn't be bipartisan at all.
What struck me from his answer is it sounded like it's possible he hadn't read the law himself before objecting to it. Is that your sense from some of the corporations you've been working with?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. They've gotten so used, these woke CEOs have gotten so used to just jerking their knees and responding in lockstep with everything that they're told to from the hard far left, that they got ahead of their ahead of whoever reads these things for them. And so they automatically said, oh, this is terrible, this is racist, and then found out that what they were being asked, what the state of Georgia had done was expand opportunities for voting, but also expand assurances that the person who has the ballot is casting it, and that there aren't boxes of ballots being pulled from under tables at 3 a.m. after there's a mysterious and convenient pipe bursting, which happened at Atlanta on election night in 2020, and other protections. And so they got out on a stupid limb, and they made stupid statements, and now it looks like they'd still like to interfere with voting integrity, but they've had to backpedal.
Scott, can you explain to us what exactly your organization is doing?
This is the heart of annual shareholder meeting season, and we're going to those meetings. They're all still virtual, but going and posing questions like we asked Coke and the Bank of America earlier in the week. And we also went this past week to Levi Strauss. And in contrast to Coke and Bank of America, Chip Bergh, who's the CEO of Levi Strauss, didn't back off at all. He doubled down, saying that that the bill in Georgia is racist, that efforts in Texas and really nationwide, there's an immense amount of support in every demographic category except loony leftists for voter integrity and voter IDs. He said that all of these efforts are steps backward, and he explicitly said that they're racist, although he wouldn't explain what exactly he thought was racist, because he's, I don't think voter ID is racist, but he didn't specify which specific provisions he thought were. And I suspect this is also an illustration of the CEO responding without knowing the details, but we have to keep, we at the FEP and all of us from the center and the right and the sensible middle of this country have to keep the heat up to make these CEOs explain very clearly. They're calling us racists for wanting clean elections. They're calling us retrograde and discriminatory. Well, that's really inflammatory language, especially with everything else that's going on these days. If they want to call us racist, they need to explain exactly what specific provisions in these laws are racist. And otherwise, they need to apologize and get back to making blue jeans and making soft drinks and flying us around the country and playing baseball.
So it seems like the left has been fairly successful in actively engaging these companies and getting them to sign on to these things. There's 400 companies or something like that now that are trying to push for the Equality Act to be passed in Washington. So do you think is the right or the conservatives just not trying as hard, or the message is not resonating? Are they not organized? What do you think are the dynamics at work here?
Well, I think you've hit an important nail right on the head, which is that we on the right, we've got families, we've got jobs. A lot of us have faith lives. We've got things to do. And we think that the left shouting in Zuccotti Park to eat the rich and all of this nonsense, we think it's nonsense. We think they're acting like fools. And so we haven't behaved that way, at least since the Tea Party era about a decade ago, which was notable for the fact that we cleaned up after ourselves and Zuccotti Park looked like a war zone. And then we stopped. But we have to actively get involved again. We have to take up the left's tactics to stop the left's attempt at strategic takeover of the entire civil life of the country. And so we would love allies at these shareholder meetings, if you own shares in these companies, to ask questions with us. And when the world opens up, if you go, you can ask the CEOs questions about their ridiculous positions face to face. And if you don't own shares, you can get in touch with customer relations and let these companies and post on their Facebook pages and on their Twitter accounts and let them know exactly what you think about their absurd positions. You can get a lot of mileage out of taking a road trip and protesting in front of the corporate buildings. Go to MLB games with T-shirts that say "One person, one vote" or voter ID, or baseball, "Get out of politics." There's all sorts of ways to make your feelings known, and corporations really do pay attention. The louder we are and the more clear we make it that we're just not going to accept this, the more likely corporations are to get themselves back into the business of being in business and not in trying to destroy the American Republic.
So let me ask you this. Why do you think so many businesses are so eager to align with the Democrats when a lot of their policies are probably not going to be good for them? They're going to, increase corporate taxes to pay for the big spending bills. Why do you think that is?
Well, in the case of big tech, I think it's because a lot of highly educated but little experienced kids got very rich very fast and don't know anything about how the world works and are themselves woke. But in a lot of other cases, it's exactly because the right doesn't campaign, doesn't engage, isn't active the way the left is. I think a lot of CEOs and people who are now CEOs got really scared during the Occupy Wall Street era and started to surrender to the hard left to try to make sure that they were eaten last. And so now you've got this group of CEOs who see an opportunity to increase their power and work their personal policy preferences into all of our lives through corporate control, but also, whether they recognize it or not, are likely to be surrendering themselves to political forces that will never respect corporations, that always intend to destroy these corporations, and they're offering themselves up on a silver platter.
And some of these companies are the ones, getting looted or burned down.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lesson that they're slow to learn, but that they need to learn. There is no buying off the hard left. Nike gives all of this money to Black Lives Matters and to the very organizations that are burning down their stores, and Starbucks is the same, and a long list of companies, and they still get their stores burnt down. Eventually, they need to learn either to stop supporting these organizations, or the corporate owners, the shareholders, have to replace them with people with a lot more sense.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Scott. We appreciate your perspective and your time.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be on with you.
Coming up next, why a researcher thinks racism in America isn't entirely what it seems. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask if you think professional sports should be getting involved in politics.
They just should be neutral. Oh, I'm very upset with that. We should let the money stay here in Atlanta. We were doing an awesome job. We was rocking with it, so why should they change?
When people come to see games and things like that, that's what they're paying to see. They're not paying to hear your political views or your political stances.
I'm a volunteer as well. I think it was horrible. They should have left it where it was supposed to be at. We were all ready and set to do this, and they need to stick with sports and let the politics stay where the politics need to stay.
No, I really think people should just keep that as their personal opinion, because it just divides the country more than it needs to be.
They have every right to behave like every other company, and other companies have that right too. But I think that being part of an organization that's national, and it goes from, high school age kids all the way up into people who retire, and I think that they all have to probably agree on standards.
I think they should, just not tell people to act on it.
I think in our country it's hard to stop anyone from having a political stance. So, I think it really just comes down to how big their influence is. But as voters and independent people, we have to make those judgments ourselves of what we're being influenced by.
Well, I think they're overpaid, way overpaid. To give them a political stance as a separate entity, no.
I've always looked at athletes as artists. I think that that's what they should stick to.
If they got a personal thing, do it on their own time. I don't think that their team as a whole should represent anything.
I feel they should have their own political views, but they should also know that they're looked up to.
If you're privately owned, you should always have your own opinions. I don't really think that should affect your business per se. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. It's one of the things that makes America so great.
Actually, no. I think sports need to just stay with sports. I mean, I think that's a lot of the problem now with everybody just politics. Everything has to be about politics.
I think Major League sports teams should be able to have a political stance because, they are celebrities, essentially, that people look to.
I don't think sports should be in politics at all. Politics shouldn't be in sports. It should be separate things, for me.
I understand why certain teams are taking a stand to participate in certain things or not, because they're trying to be supportive.
Yeah, fight for what you believe on.
Well, I think that they are regarded with a standing in the community, and people pay attention to them, and so I think it is appropriate.
People watch sports for the escape from reality, and bringing all of that political garbage into sports is ruining it all for everybody.
They're entitled to their opinion in where they want to have their game played, but it's all become political. Everything, masks, vaccines, so we're in a strange time.
Accusations of racism are everywhere these days, but it's often taboo to question racism itself. Our next guest recently published a very interesting and controversial report called The Social Construction of Racism in the United States. It contains new surveys and past research and basically makes the case that the public doesn't have an accurate impression of how much racism exists in America today. We're joined now by Professor Eric Kaufman, adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a professor of politics at London University. Professor, welcome.
Good to be here, Cindy.
So you wrote a very interesting report that revealed a lot of things about perceptions of racism and the existence of racism itself in America. Could you just start by walking us through what you found to be most revealing in your research?
Well, really, the report very much makes the case that perceptions of racism are in many cases driven by the media and by partisanship rather than by reality. And so just to give you sort of a top-line statistic, perceptions of racism, for example, have been the perception that race relations are good in America. We're at about 70%, running from about 2000 to 2013. Since 2014, the share of Americans saying race relations are good has dropped down to 30 to 40%, just in the last sort of 5-6 years. At the same time, we know, however, that attitudes to interracial marriage, for example, and the actual number of interracial marriages has been going up and up. So, for example, in 1990, over 50% of white Americans opposed interracial marriage. That's now under 10%. We know that the number of African Americans shot by police has declined 60 to 80% since the late 1960s. So, at the same time as reality of attitudes and behaviors has been getting less and less racist, we're seeing the opposite perception. In fact, America is getting more and more racist. I was interested in that divergence, why that occurred. And so we can see many, many ways in which that occurs due to the media. So, for example, if you track the use of the term racist or white supremacist or white privilege in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, new online news sites, that's exploded from about 2014-15 onwards. With that huge increase, which we can measure through word counts, or we could measure it in Google Trends and other places, it's a well-documented phenomenon that there was a sort of conscious editorial decision to move in this direction. And at the same time, we see that opinion amongst particularly white liberal Americans, but to some extent all liberal Americans, shifts on questions around race and diversity dramatically to levels that we haven't seen for many decades. So this shift is, in my view, tied very much to media dynamics rather than to anything happening on the ground. If it were tied to what's actually happening on the ground, concern over racism would actually be declining, and the share of people saying race relations are good would be rising. But it's the citizen journalism, it's the vivid imagery circulated on social media and on the internet. That's what's really driving people's perceptions of the size of the problem.
So that's very interesting. So there's perceptions of the problem itself, which I get. So people are, picking that up through media and social media. What about the experiences of racism? What are you seeing in the reporting of that?
It's not just perceptions of racism as a national problem, but even personal experiences are inflected by what's one's partisanship. So, for example, we see a big difference between people who are Republican and Democrat. African Americans, for example, who say that white Republicans are racist versus African Americans who say that they are not racist. We've got a gap of 20 to 35 points between the one group and the other group on whether they've personally experienced various forms of racism and discrimination. Also, exposure to social media. A 2016 Pew survey data that I used showed that African Americans on social media, about 30% reported things such as people being afraid of you or everyday racism, whereas the share amongst those who were on social media was over 50%. So 20 points higher just amongst those on social media compared to those who are not. That really shouldn't be affecting your experience of people being afraid of you or acting like you're not smart. That really isn't something that you should be reporting much higher levels of just because you're on social media. So I think this is sort of speaking to the impact of social media exposure on even personal perceptions of racism. And that I found quite interesting. In addition, for example, with partisanship, black Trump supporters compared to black Biden supporters, you see that black Biden supporters, 40% of them report monthly or more racist incidents, experiences under the Trump administration, and only 20% under the Obama administration, whereas black Trump voters report 30% under both. So, we'd have to imagine that perhaps people who are inflicting these, racism on African Americans are able to pick out the Biden voters over the Trump voters. It just doesn't make any sense other than through this prism of partisanship. And we see that sort of the way partisanship sort of amplifies people's interpretation of reality in the direction of finding more racism, particularly through one statistic, which is really, I asked a question, which is a very fact-based question. Do you think that that young African Americans are more likely to be killed by a police bullet or in a car accident? Now, we know from the statistics, which are very good on this, it's about 10 times more likely to be killed in a car accident than being shot by the police. And yet, what we see is 8 in 10 African-American Biden voters saying a young African-American is more likely to be shot by the police than die in a car accident. And 7 in 10 whites who believe that white Republicans are racist agree with that point. So they're both getting the question wrong. This is a factual question. Their ideology is distorting their perception of reality. I mean, it's the ideology coupled with the kind of media diet, coupled to some extent with the social media ties they have. All of those things are framing reality for them in a way that simply creates a perception of a much bigger problem nationally, and also framing and interpreting everyday experiences, or perhaps constructing experiences in a way that those of another partisanship aren't.
So, I found that question about the, how young African Americans are more likely to die very interesting because that one's fact-based. You can measure it. You can know that it's wrong.
Right.
So one question I have is, how much do you think there's a factor of personal definitions of racism and what a racist, act or comment might be being different among groups?
Well, I think this is a big ideological split. So do you think something like, if someone says, I don't notice race, some people, there are people who would say, well, that's racist. That's kind of a microaggression. And what we see, for example, in the data is African Americans who have a degree are much more likely to say something like, I don't notice race, or America is a colorblind society. They're much more likely to call that racist. This is kind of or be offended by that, sorry. So the definition of racism is flexible depending on your ideology, and clearly progressives are wanting to expand the definition of racism to include a lot more things. Any disparity, but any group disparity on something like education, income, health, housing, whatever, will be automatically interpreted as racism by by many progressives, whereas conservatives will say, well, we have to control for other factors such as socioeconomic background, which is linked to other things, including the income of a particular group when they entered the country as immigrants, or perhaps the legacy of the past, or perhaps it might have to do with family or whatever. So a much more sort of nuanced approach that would say there is racism, it's not been eradicated, but we have to actually control for other confounding factors. And once we've done that and refuted counter arguments, then we can talk about the remaining bit as racism. But to actually just look at any bivariate disparity and call that racism is an example of this expansion of the term racism.
And of course, the implications of your work are pretty significant. I mean, we saw in the recent Project Veritas CNN video that, I mean, what we all know, that if it bleeds, it leads, that media, is driven by that sort of coverage. But, I mean, the implications are pretty big because people are on the streets protesting, they're calling for defunding the police, and all of this could be a very mistaken perception about how bad the problem actually is.
Yeah, and that has two consequences. So, for example, when Joe Biden or Barack Obama are talking about this as a racist problem, something like the George Floyd killing, this is actually in many ways to frame it and racialize it in a way that it may simply be an issue of police brutality. So instead of uniting people, you're actually rubbing on some of the divisions. One group feels they've been slighted unfairly, and people have been generalizing about, say, white people or police, and saying they're all this way or they're all that way. And at the same time, also, we have to bear in mind, in addition to the divisiveness of this rhetoric, there is also the impact on African Americans, and just doesn't seem like many people want to talk about that impact. There was a study that looked at cities that had BLM protests, for example, had a 10% increase or 10% higher murder rates than those that didn't have BLM protests in the period 2014 to 2019. And that's a careful academic study, and it came out in Vox as well. And so the increase in deaths there is on the order of several thousand. So we have several thousand deaths, mainly African American deaths. And this is now before the kind of crime wave that we've seen since mid-2020 as a result of the most recent wave. So there's a huge cost to ramping up threat perceptions, talking about defund the police, leading to reduced policing typically leads to more anarchy and violence. And there doesn't seem to be any accountability and responsibility being taken for that. So that maybe actually we should be more restrained. We should look at the complexity of policing in relation to communities, and maybe actually it's not such a great idea to keep hammering on to this narrative, rather than saying, actually, we have cases very similar to George Floyd's, like Tony Timpa, a white man who's had a very similar experience in 2016. Very little interest in that, little interest in the fact that, when you control for police interactions, that whites and blacks are alike. There's a similar propensity to be shot by the police, that these are exceedingly rare events. The notion that somehow young African Americans are at risk of randomly being shot by the police. I mean, this completely fallacious image seems to be propagated even by elites. It doesn't seem like they're taking any responsibility for what are really mistruths. It's like saying that you're likely to be blown up in a terrorist attack, at any time. I mean, it's completely irresponsible.
Yeah, right. Well, I hope more people get a chance to read your report, because I think there's some really important findings in here, although it might be resisted.
Right. Well, thanks, Cindy.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Coming up next, how has work life changed over the past year of living with the pandemic? We find out from 3 people in very different professions. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask the same question to Americans across the country.
Well, I work in the medical field, so obviously more precaution.
It's been great to not face any traffic, but it's been very difficult emotionally for a lot of the staff to not be able to see one another and just to get into random conversations.
I'm looking for a job, which kind of makes it a little tough during COVID times.
Online school was definitely a big shift, especially since the end of my sophomore year got cut off by COVID.
It's definitely been much harder for me to learn because of online school. Like, I haven't been able to pay attention as well because I'm sitting at home instead of like in class. It's also different because I couldn't see my friends or anything, so like definitely social life impacted. My group of friends got a lot smaller.
We started using a wagon for transports instead of having prisoners in the back of a car with an officer. We'd have to disinfect everything as soon as we were done with the transport. They were trying to control the numbers in the jail, so a lot of the people we would normally arrest, we were cutting breaks to or giving court appearances to keep the jail numbers down.
Actually, I worked a lot more than I did the year before prior. In 2020, once COVID started, for instance, we did a downtown Indianapolis hotel, 1,000 rooms, and there was only 7 people in the hotel. They shut it down. But we were considered essential workers, so we actually were able to finish the job about 3 days early. There's nobody there.
At the start of COVID, we were doing maybe like $10 a day. Like it was terrible working in the mall and doing little to no business. As of like maybe the last month or two, it's been changing.
My work life changed over the past year for the greater. Number one, I'm retired.
Not too much. I do have to wear a mask every day.
Since I work from home, I enjoy working from home, so it's been better for me.
There's no work, completely out of work. In fact, I'm going right now to go play somewhere, do a little rehearsal with a pianist, because they let us come indoors and practice a little bit. The whole year we've had nothing, no students even. My orchestra was sitting around, I don't know what they did to survive, and in fact, our tour was canceled. We had a tour going to China with my orchestra.
I'm worried about the world, but personally, we've done just great. So, good luck.
It's been an unusual year, to say the least. Most of us have gotten used to Zoom meetings and kids learning from home. Today, we meet 3 people from 3 professions where it might not be obvious how they might be faring under pandemic work limitations. Joining us to tell us their experiences, we have Dr. David Prologo, an interventional radiologist. We have William Pugh, who's the founder of the William Pugh Music Academy. And we have Jenn Gavin, a dog trainer and animal behavior consultant. Welcome to all of you. You all come from very different professions, and I'm sure have had very different experiences over the last year. So, Dr. Prologo, why don't we start with you? What has been the impact of the last year on your work?
Oh gosh, Cindy, I think that the immediate impact was the most dramatic for sure. Early on when this started, as a hospital-based physician and all the hospital-based healthcare workers, our lives were really turned upside down almost overnight. And we had to be here, and we had to be protected in an environment where there was a new virus being transmitted. Everyone was scared. Protective equipment was scarce, and then on top of that, we had to organize and continue to meet in the evenings. And a lot of times we were away from our families because we were afraid of the transmission, and so our regular schedules and our regular days got upended. And for months on end, we just reported to duty, I guess, to take care of as many people as we could for as long as we could without knowing what the next day would bring. And so I think that immediate impact was so exhausting and so traumatic that's the first thing that comes to mind when you ask what changed or what impact did I experience during the last year.
So now, why don't we move to you, William? Why don't you give us your first reaction? What changed for you in your industry?
Mostly is adopting technology in our industry. Music industry has been pretty much the same way since its inception about 300 years ago. So the lesson is taught based on one-on-one, and the student learning things directly from their teacher, and the teacher have a hands-on approach to their students. And this adapting of the virtual lesson online to us is a new challenge for our industry.
So what kind of music lessons are you doing online? For all kinds of instruments or certain ones?
We're pretty much doing everything online, and it goes from string instruments, violin, viola, cello, and goes to piano, and woodwinds, brass, and composition, and even singing. So we do all kinds of lessons online initially, yes.
All right, when I come back to you, I want you to explain a little bit about how that works. But Jenn, why don't we jump to you? So what's changed in your world?
We're busy. I think our industry has seen record numbers of adoptions, both from rescues and from breeders. And as part of that, we're seeing a sharp uptick in the number of dangerous behaviors, dog bites and aggression cases in our industry. I'm currently working 7 days a week. And that's been a tough thing. I think if you take a look at the Journal of Pediatrics and some of the scholarly articles out there, as soon as stay-at-home orders started, we saw a sharp uptick.
So that's very interesting. Dr. Prologo, let me go back to you. How are things now? What has sort of permanently changed? What went back to normal?
I think that the most striking thing that has permanently changed or semi-permanently changed is telehealth. We're able to see patients, of course, via Skype, as we're using now, or Zoom appointments or FaceTime or other telehealth modalities. And that actually opens up a flexibility for us. Now we can see patients on a Thursday or a Monday when otherwise we couldn't because we only had inpatient appointments on Wednesday. And it also allows us to see patients a little bit easier who are traveling from out of state for specialty care. And so the implementation of telehealth to our practice was, I think, an improvement and an expansion that followed from our COVID adjustments.
Is there anything you're not able to do with a telehealth visit that you would be able to do in person?
Certainly, we can't examine the patients, and that's been a subject of much discussion for us, how to manage someone's description or to see something that someone wants you to examine. It's a little more difficult that way, but it forces us to open up our communication, which is yet another improvement, I think, another advantage potentially.
And William, maybe you can explain to us a little bit about how a remote piano lesson works or violin. I mean, of course, you have to really see what the student is doing. So how does that work?
Yeah, actually, it works better on the older students than the younger ones. And like you said, it's being hands-on teacher, adjust students' posture, and it's a must. And but we cannot do this online, so it poses a challenge to the teacher that has to explain things very concisely and also simple to understand. And so the way of communication has changed, and I think it's more to a teacher to adapt a new style of teaching.
So how do you do it technologically wise? I guess you need a couple of cameras. What does it look like?
Right. We have a range from simple just Zoom call, and which is, I think, is a vast majority teacher are doing with Zoom, and with some exception of using very high-end microphone, which has cut the time lapse to the minimum. But no matter how minimal, it still is time lapse. That's nothing can replace the live lessons, and so we have to limit our like playing together with our students. It's impossible. So we have to talk more, and it seems like more explanation, use more words than the sound in some cases.
And do you feel like they're progressing as quickly or stunted through this?
I think most students are adapting very well, and doing that a year of virtual lesson, we actually being able to host an online competition, and students will practice at home and submitting their video clips, and then we have a panel of judges to give them scores and awards, and that really motivated their practicing at home, and the parents and students both raved about that competition.
Oh, yeah. That sounds great. And so, Jenn, I guess at the beginning were you seeing dogs remotely, or how did that work?
So I've always seen a few dogs remotely. Certainly, the number I'm seeing virtually has increased exponentially. In fact, I typically am doing most of my behavior consults virtually for the first consult because there's a lot of history taking involved.
And when you do those remote consultations, is the dog there as well, or just the human? The dog is there as well. So do you feel like you can get a good enough sense from looking at them on camera?
You know, seeing a dog in the home has advantages and disadvantages. Oftentimes when I'm working with a dog, they're not going to behave in the same way that they might at home when they come to school for dogs, or even if I were to do a house call when there's a stranger in the home. And so it gives me a nice baseline that I might not otherwise have. And like I said, I typically am doing my follow-ups in person with masks and social distancing. So I kind of get the best of both worlds, and I really.
Interesting. And Dr. Prologo, what lessons have you learned that you didn't expect or would never have come across otherwise?
I think that we learned that we really do count as a society on people like first responders, firemen, police, the medics, the hospital system. We really do count on them being there. And it isn't something that we think about on a day-to-day basis until something like this happens. And we look to the hospitals and expect everyone to be there. And we were here, and we did the best that we could. But I think it's a learning point that we live in a place where we have access to health care, and maybe sometimes can take that for granted. So a lesson that I can learn, and we can potentially all learn, is to sort of be grateful for this infrastructure that we have in this great nation that we live in.
Oh, that's beautiful, and I definitely thank you for your work, as I'm sure most people do for our frontline workers. And William, how about you? What lessons have you learned from this?
We find out this actually happened not all bad to our industry, and some actually are kind of positive, that pleasantly surprised to us. For example, now we'll be able to bring top experts and around the world, and giving master classes to our students in Atlanta. And so we had a master class, invited a professor from Beijing and China, and from Norway, and from Iceland. And so I find out it's rather easy now, and which is before not only costs a lot, and then also hard to schedule. Now this become a plus for us. But of course, the large ensemble for our students still is quite difficult to start, because of the social distance, and parents worry about too many people mingle together. So that yet to be solved. And I think moving on, and as the pandemic gets better, solved better and better, and we'll be able to bring back these large ensemble programs to our students.
Oh, that's so interesting. And Jen, how about you? Lessons learned?
Yes, I think that this has really shown a light on a big need for some regulation and some education. We are seeing clients being heartbroken and traumatized when they adopt a new dog, even oftentimes a puppy, who has behavior issues. The dog training industry is completely unregulated. So clients who are don't know where to go to get accurate, valid information, finding themselves heartbroken, biting, mouthing, and having extreme anxiety.
And do you think this extra aggression and biting, is it because there's unusual home situations, or just more people are, adopting dogs that might not have otherwise?
Thanks for asking that. I think it's a combination of factors. I think this was a long time coming. I've seen a steady inclination to adopt out dogs that previously might not have been adopted out in rescues, especially dogs with bite histories. I think we're seeing the culmination. So we have dogs who have previously been humans who are now being adopted out. And I think we're seeing a lot of people trying to capitalize on the demand for dogs and puppies by breeding when they don't have a lot of knowledge about genetics, about early neurological development, and what it takes to raise a behaviorally sound and healthy puppy.
Excellent. And Dr. Prologo, what are things like in the hospital now that we know a lot more about the disease? Obviously, the peak has passed. What are things like now?
I think the focus really now is on those patients who got delayed, who didn't have COVID or coronavirus, and that is the diabetic patient or the patient with cancer or the patient with longstanding heart disease. Another thing that I think is useful to consider is that during the pandemic, as we rushed to take care of all the new communicable patients, coronavirus patients, a lot of those patients got put on hold. Cancer care got put on hold. I do a lot of pain management, which got put on hold, and we got backed up. So as the pandemic started to come under some degree of control, the first thing we had to do was decompress and open up for all of those folks and take care of their medical problems, their issues, their pain as quickly as we could. And we're still playing catch up in that regard.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something I've thought about a lot during this pandemic. Do you think people, I mean, I guess there was cancer diagnoses that probably didn't happen. What do you think is sort of the long-term impact of all of this?
So the long-term impact really, I think, will help us prioritize these conditions and realize that we've got to take care of them independently as well and have a plan for them independently and know that they are important and that they count on us for management of their disease, be it cancer or pain or other subspecialties even that I'm not mentioning now. So we've got to have a plan to run those things in parallel should there be another emergency down the road.
Very interesting. And William, what do you think will be permanently changed in your industry because of this, even if things go back to normal? I mean, I'm just thinking students could now shop around to, you know, a music academy anywhere in the world. They could collaborate with people in different places. So what do you think has changed permanently?
Yeah, I think that this technology brings the world smaller, brings everything within reach of click of button. And so, like you said, and audience can shop around for the concert they want to listen. Student can shop around for the teacher they want to study with. But however, and I think that most things change as, and I hope people realize the value of music that has to do with bring everybody together in a time like a pandemic. And there was a very moving story that in Italy, and one of the neighbor and a young guy is playing piano and doing the quarantine, and somehow the neighbor, and who he never met before, and respond within the piano, and so apparently both of them play piano, so they communicating with each other daily through piano music for like a 3 or 4 months, and without seeing each other, and but they kind of communicating through the music, you know, break the barrier of the wall, and they find comfort in each other. So those are, music is in a time like a pandemic, it can do a lot of good things, beautiful things to people.
That's a beautiful story. I do remember the viral videos, I think, from Italy where, you know, people were singing together from their balconies. And, you know, it was one of those rare feel-good moments in the early days of the pandemic. And Jenn, we'll wrap up with you. How about you? What's changed permanently going forward, do you think?
Well, I'm hoping that the change going forward that will be that we will have a spotlight on dog bite prevention, and that what will come of this, which is really kind of a tough spot we're in right now, will be more education.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It's wonderful to hear all of these very, very different experiences.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy.
That's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.